Harry bent over the crystal ball and stared, as hard as he could, willing it to show him something other than swirling white fog. But nothing happened. Well, Professor Trelawney prompted him delicately. What do you see? The heat was overpowering, and his nostrils were stinging with the perfumed smoke wafting from the fire beside them. He thought of what Ron had just said, and decided to pretend. Said Harry, I see a dark shape. What does it resemble? Whispered Professor Trelawney. Think now. Harry cast his mind around, and it landed on Buckbeak. A hippogriff, he said firmly. Indeed, whispered Professor Trelawney, scribbling keenly on the parchment perched on her knees. My boy, you may be seeing the outcome of poor Hagrid's poor trouble with the Ministry of Magic. Look closer. Does the hippogriff appear to have its head? Yes, said Harry firmly. Are you sure? Professor Trelawney urged him. Are you quite sure, dear? Don't you see it writhing on the ground, perhaps? A shadowy figure raised with an axe behind it? No, said Harry, starting to feel slightly sick. No blood. No weeping, Hagrid. No. Said Harry again, wanting more than ever to leave the room in the heat. It looks fine. It's flying away. Professor Trelawney sighed. Well, dear, I think we'll just leave it there. A little disappointing, but I'm sure you did your best. Relieved, Harry got up, picked up his bag, turned to go, and then a loud, harsh voice came from behind him. It will happen tonight. Harry reeled round. Professor Trelawney had gone rigid in her arm. Her eyes were unfocused and her mouth sagging. Sorry, said Harry. But Professor Trelawney didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes started to roll. Harry stood there in a panic. She looked as though she was about to have some sort of seizure. He hesitated, thinking of running to the hospital wing, and then Professor Trelawney spoke again, in the same harsh voice, with quite unlike her own. The Dark Lord lies alone, friendless and abandoned in his followers. His servant has been chained these 12 years. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will break free and set out and rejoin his master. The Dark Lord will rise again with his servant's aid, greater and more terrible than ever before. Tonight, before midnight, the servant will set out to rejoin his master. Professor Trelawney's head fell forward onto her chest. She made a grunting sort of noise, and quite suddenly Professor Trelawney's head snapped back up. I'm sorry, dear boy, she said dreamily. The heat of the day, you know. I drifted off for a moment. Harry stood there, still staring. Is there anything wrong, my dear? You just told me the Dark Lord was going to rise again, and his servant was going to go back to him. Professor Trelawney looked thoroughly startled. The Dark Lord? He who must not be named? My dear boy, that's hardly something to joke about. Rise again, indeed. But you just said it. You said the Dark Lord. I think you must have dozed off too, dear, said Professor Trelawney. I would certainly presume to predict anything quite as far-fetched as that. Harry climbed back down the ladder and the spiral staircase and wondering, had he just heard Professor Trelawney make a real prediction? Or had that been her idea of an impressive end to a test? 5 minutes later, he was dashing around, past the security trolls, out to the entrance of the Gryffindor Tower, Professor Trelawney's words still resounding in his head. People were striding past him in the opposite direction, laughing and joking, heading to the grounds, a bit of a long-awaited freedom. By the time he had reached the portrait hole and entered the common room, he was almost deserted. Over in the corner, however, where sat Ron and Hermione. Professor Trelawney, he panted, just told me. But he stopped abruptly at the sight of their faces. Buckbeak lost, said Ron weakly. Hagrid just sent this. Hagrid's note was dry this time. No tears had splattered on it, yet his hand seemed to have been shaken, so much so that he wrote hardly legible. Lost appeal. They're going to execute at sunset. Nothing you can do. Don't come down. I don't want you to see it. Hagrid. We've got to go, said Harry at once. We can't just sit here on his own. Wait for the executioner. Sunset, though, Ron, said Ron, who was staring out the window in a glazed sort of way. We'd never be allowed, especially you, Harry. Harry sank his head into his hands, thinking, if only we had the invisibility cloak. Where is it? Said Hermione. Harry told her about leaving it in the passageway under the one-eyed witch. If Snape sees me anywhere near that again, I'm in serious trouble, he finished. That's true, said Hermione, getting to her feet. If he sees you. How do you open the witch's hump again? You tap it and say, Discendium, said Harry, but Hermione didn't wait for it the rest of the sentence, so she strode off to the room, pushed open the fat lady's portrait, and vanished from sight. She hasn't gone to get it, Ron said, staring after her. She had. Hermione returned a quarter of an hour later with the silvery cloak folded carefully under her robes. Hermione, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, said Ron, astounded. First you hit Malfoy, then you walk out on Professor Trelawney. Hermione looked rather flattered. They went down to the dinner with everybody else, but they did not return to Gryffindor Tower. Afterward, Harry had the cloak down the front of his robes. He had kept his arms folded to hide the lump. They skulked away in the empty chamber of the entrance hall, listening until they were sure it was deserted. They had the last pair of people but hurrying across the hall of the door, slamming. Hermione poked her head around the door. Okay, she whispered. No one there. Cloak on. Walking very close to one another so nobody could see them, they crossed the hall and tiptoed beneath the cloak, and they walked down the stone stairs to the grounds. The sun was already sinking behind the forbidden forest. Gliding on the top of the branches of the trees, they reached Hagrid's cabin and knocked. He was a minute in answering. When he did, he looked around for his visitor, pale face trembling. It's us, Harry hissed. We're wearing the invisibility cloak. Let us in so we can take it off. You shouldn't have come, Hagrid whispered, but he stood and stepped aside. Hagrid shut the door quickly, and Harry pulled off the cloak. Hagrid was not crying, nor did he throw himself upon their necks. He looked like a man who did not know where he was or what to do. This helplessness was worse than watching the tears. Want some tea? He said. His great hands were shaking as he reached for the kettle. Where's Buckbeak, Hagrid? Said Hermione hesitantly. I took him outside, said Hagrid, spilling milk all over the table as he was filling up the jug. He's tethered in me pumpkin patch. Thought he ought to see the trees and smell some fresh air before. Hagrid's hand trembled so violently that the milk jug slipped from his grasp and shattered all over the floor. I'll do it, Hagrid, said Hermione quickly, hurrying over and starting to clean up the mess. There's another one in the cupboard. Hagrid sat down, wiping his forehead with the sleeve. Harry glanced at Ron, who looked back hopelessly. Isn't there anything anyone can do, Hagrid? Harry asked fiercely, sitting down next to him. Dumbledore? He's tried, said Hagrid. He's got no power to override the committee. He told 'em Buckbeak's all right, but they're scared. You know what Lucius Malfoy is like. Threatening 'em, I expect. His executioner, McNair, he's an old pale of Malfoy's. But it'll be quick and clean. And I'll be beside him. Hagrid swallowed. His eyes were darting all over the cabin, looking through the shred of hope and comfort. Dumbledore's going to come down while it happens. Well, wrote me this morning. Said he wants to be with the great man, Dumbledore. Hermione, who had been rummaging in Hagrid's cupboard for another milk jug, let out a small, quickly stifled sob. She straightened up with the new jug in her hands, fighting back tears. We'll stay with you too, Hagrid, she began, and Hagrid shook his shaggy head. No, you're to go back to the castle. I told you, I don't want you watching. And you shouldn't be down here anyways. If Fudge and Dumbledore catch you without permission, Harry, you'll be in big trouble. Silent tears were now streaming down Hermione's face, but she hid them from Hagrid, bustling around making tea. Then she picked up the milk bottle, poured some in the jug, and she let out a shriek. Ron! I don't believe it! It's Scabbers! Ron gaped at her. What are you talking about? Hermione carried the milk jug over to the table and overturned it upside down. With a frantic squeak and much scrambling about to get back inside, Scabbers the rat came sliding onto the table. Scabbers! Said Ron blankly. Scabbers? What are you doing here? And he grabbed a struggling rat and held him up in the light. Scabbers looked dreadful. He was thinner than ever. Large tufts of hair had fallen out, leaving wide, bald patches where he writhed in Ron's hand, though desperate to free himself. It's okay, Scabbers, said Ron. No cats. There's nothing here to hurt you. Hagrid suddenly stood up, and his eyes fixed on the window. His normally ruddy face had gone color of parchment. They're coming. Harry, Ron, and Hermione whipped around. A group of men were walking in the distant castle steps. In front was Albus Dumbledore, his silver beard gleaming in the dying sun. Next to him trotted Cornelius Fudge. Behind him came a feeble old committee member and the executioner, McNair. You gotta go, said Hagrid. Every inch of him was trembling. They mustn't find you here. Go now. Ron stuffed Scabbers into his pocket. Hermione picked up the cloak. I'll let you out the back way, said Hagrid. They followed him to the door into the back of his garden. They followed him to the door. Harry felt strangely unreal, and even more so that he saw Buckbeats yards away, tethered to a tree behind Hagrid's pumpkin patch. Buckbeat seemed to know something was happening. He turned his sharp-beaked head from side to side and pawed the ground nervously. It's okay, Beaky, said Hagrid softly. It's okay. Then he turned to Ron and Hermione. Go on, he said. Get going. But they didn't move. Hagrid, we can't. We'll tell them what's really happened. They can't kill him. Go, said Hagrid fiercely. It's bad enough without you lot being in trouble and all. They had no choice. As Hermione threw on the cloak over Harry and Ron, they heard voices, and from the front of the cabin, Hagrid looked at the good place that he had just vanished from sight. Go quick, he said hoarsely. Don't listen. And then he strode back to his cabin as someone knocked the front door. Slowly, in a kind of horrified trance, Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off silently around Hagrid's house. As they reached the other side of the front door, closed with a sharp snap. Please, let's hurry, Hermione whispered. I can't stand it. I can't bear it. So they started up the sloping lawn towards the castle. The sun was sinking now, and the sky had turned to a clear purple-tinged gray. But the west was there, a ruby-red glow. Ron stopped dead. Oh, please, Ron, Hermione begged. It's Scabbers. He won't stay put. Ron bent over, trying to keep Scabbers in his pocket, but the rat was going berserk, squeaking madly, twisting and flailing, and it sank its teeth into Ron's hand. Scabbers, it's me, you idiot! It's Ron! Ron hissed. They heard the doors open behind them and men's voices. Oh, Ron, please, let's move. They're going to do it, Hermione breathed. Okay, Scabbers, stay put. They walked forward. Harry, like Hermione, was trying not to listen to the rumble of the voices behind them. Ron stopped again. I can't hold him. Scabbers, shut up. Everyone will hear us. The rat was squeaking wildly, but not loudly enough to cover up the sounds of the drifting from Hagrid's garden. There was a jumble of indistinct male voices and silence, and then without warning, the unmistakable swish and thud of an axe. Hermione swayed on the spot. They did it, she whispered to Harry. I don't believe it. They did it.